Guy Penrod's family kept quiet for a long time, and the people who loved him closest kept it that way on purpose. Angie, his wife, stayed out of the spotlight with a grace that fans noticed and respected, and his children grew up away from the cameras that followed their father across stages and television screens for more than a decade. That wall of privacy held for years. It changed when one of Guy's daughters sat down and started talking, not for a magazine profile or a promotional appearance, but because she believed the people who loved her father deserved to hear the version of him that the stage never fully showed. What she shared wasn't a scandal or a controversy, and that's what makes it land harder than either of those things would have. The truth about who Guy Penrod is when the music stops, and what it genuinely cost him to be the man that millions of fans believed they already knew, had been held quietly by his closest friends for years. Stay with us, because at the 10-minute mark of this video, the part of Guy Penrod's story that the gospel community has never fully heard out loud is finally going to be told. Spend any time in the world of gospel music and Southern gospel, and the name Guy Penrod needs no introduction. Joining the Gaither Vocal Band in 1994, Penrod brought something to that stage that nobody had quite put there before, and audiences felt it from the very first concert. Great singers had stood behind those microphones before him, and great singers would stand thereafter. But the combination of that deep, searching tenor voice, the long hair, the cowboy frame, and the way he seemed to forget entirely that cameras existed once he entered worship, set him apart from everyone who had come before. People who first found him through the early homecoming videos know exactly what those recordings did to them. For millions of devoted fans across 3 decades of Christian music, Penrod's voice became the one that showed up at the hardest moments, playing in the background when someone said goodbye to a parent, coming through car speakers on a Sunday drive when grief finally broke loose, carrying words of faith into rooms where ordinary language fell short. He was never simply a performer to those people. Guy Penrod was a minister who happened to sing for a living. The songs themselves are permanently embedded in the memory of anyone who came of age with contemporary Christian music in their home. Glorious, redeemed, he is. All of them delivered standing at the front of the stage with his arms open and his eyes closed, leading rooms full of believers into something that audiences have described consistently across the years as the closest thing to heaven they had touched in this life. Meanwhile, back in Tennessee, Guy and Angie Penrod were raising 8 children together, building a faith-centered household that he has spoken about with obvious pride in every interview where the subject came up. A legendary voice, a devoted family, and a ministry that reached hearts in every corner of the country. By any visible measure, this was a man the gospel community considered genuinely blessed. And that's exactly why what his daughter said shifts the entire picture. Understanding what she shared requires going back to where Guy Penrod stood in the mid-2000s, because the context matters considerably. 14 years with the Gaither Vocal Band had produced some of the most beloved recordings in the history of religious music, and Penrod had become in many ways the emotional center audiences associated with the group, the presence that locks a moment into memory years after you watched the footage. The touring schedule pressed on without real rest. The recording schedule pressed on alongside it, and every year added more weight to the demands on his time, his energy, and his body, so that by 2008, something had to change. When the departure from the Gaither Vocal Band came that year, the gospel community responded with genuine sadness, and the speculation started almost immediately. Some fans assumed health was the reason, others pointed toward the natural pull of solo work. The official statements were warm and gracious and notably short on specifics, which is how those things tend to go. And Penrod spoke about Bill Gaither's influence on his life, about the gratitude he carried for every night on that stage, and left most of the rest unsaid. What he left unsaid is exactly what his daughter has now put into words. She painted a picture of a father who poured everything he had into the ministry, night after night, performance after performance, praying before every concert, and then making his way back to hotel rooms in cities he had already lost count of. Phone calls home came at strange hours, and she noticed early that the voice coming through the phone sounded different from the one that filled an arena. Growing up in that household meant carrying a specific kind of pride alongside a specific kind of awareness, even as a young girl, that her father was holding something heavy the stage never showed. Here's the thing, though. What she revealed isn't the story most people braced themselves to hear. No resentment surfaced. No account of lasting damage or bitterness came through, even as she spoke honestly about the long stretches her father spent on the road. What came through instead was something more complicated and ultimately more moving than a straightforward account of sacrifice. Her father's Christian faith is where the account turns. Specifically, she described the seasons when that faith went through testing that never appeared on a recording. The period when Guy Penrod, the man thousands of fans watched raising his hands in worship on television week after week, was working through questions in private that had no easy answers. Questions about calling. Questions about whether the life the road had built around him still lined up with the convictions he carried everywhere he went. Stay with us, because what she said about that season and what it tells us about the decision Guy made in 2008 and everything that followed is the part of this story that gospel media has almost entirely missed. This is where the story arrives at the part his daughter clearly hadn't planned to say out loud. The part that puts everything before it into a different frame. She talked about a specific season, not naming an exact year, but placing it in the stretch just before Guy's departure from the Gaither Vocal Band, when he came back from touring and sat with his family in a way that registered differently from the usual returns. No crisis, no collapse, none of the drama that rumors sometimes attached to that period. Just the quiet and deliberate manner of a man who had done serious thinking on the road, arrived somewhere honest, and was ready to share what he found there. Penrod gathered his children and told them, in plain language, that he had been wrestling with what it actually meant to live the songs he sang, not to perform them in front of audiences, but to genuinely carry them home. Redeemed meant something specific to him. Glorious meant something. Every word he had ever put that voice behind represented a covenant he held with complete seriousness, and he told his children that he had come to believe the way he was living needed to line up more closely with that covenant. The music wasn't ending. What was ending was the distance he had allowed to build, gradually and without drama, between the man he wanted to be and the schedule the road had constructed around him. That conversation permanently altered how his daughter understood her father, not because it made him larger than life, but because it showed him as genuinely human in a way no performance ever could. The man she had watched move thousands of people to tears in arenas and church halls was sitting in her family's home, admitting out loud that he was still growing, still pressing against hard questions, still holding his religious faith up to the light and asking what it required of him next. The emotion surfaced years later, when she described what she finally understood about 2008. Stepping back from the Gaither Vocal Band was not Guy Penrod walking away from his calling in Christian music. It was him walking toward the 8 people at home in Tennessee who deserved the same full presence that audiences had always received from him, the same quality of attention, the same willingness to show up without reservation. Artists who worked alongside Guy for years have spoken about this quality in their own ways. Lowry, who never ran short of opinions about anything or anyone, put it plainly in multiple interviews. Penrod ranked among the most genuinely sincere people he had ever shared a stage with across his entire career. David Phelps, whose own voice carried forward the tradition Penrod helped define within the Gaither Vocal Band, has pointed to that influence as something he still carries in his own work. Those weren't polished compliments delivered for the camera. Those were assessments from men who had watched Guy Penrod operate up close, on stage and off, and were reporting exactly what they found. His daughter's account lands as a confirmation of what the most devoted fans already carried somewhere in their understanding. The Guy Penrod visible in the homecoming videos wasn't a crafted persona constructed for television. That was him, and the private father who sat with his children and spoke honestly about the gap between the life he wanted and the life the road had been demanding was consistent, right through to the details, with everything those fans had believed about him for 30 years. The revelation isn't a scandal, and it isn't a hidden failure. It's the portrait of a man in gospel music who loved God and loved his family, and cared enough about both to be honest about what staying on the road was actually costing everyone, and then did something about it. Anyone who has followed Guy Penrod through the homecoming stages, through the solo recordings, through 30 years of moments when that voice reached somewhere that plain language never quite manages, will feel the weight of what his daughter shared in a particular way. The culture has trained audiences to brace for the opposite story. Too many accounts have broken in one direction, where the private person behind a public ministry turns out to be a stranger to the one performing on stage, and that pattern has made fans cautious in advance. We wait for the curtain to fall on something we would rather not see, and the expectation of betrayal has become almost reflexive for anyone who follows people in visible religious life closely enough to genuinely care about them. What Penrod's daughter delivered was the opposite of that story, and the rarity of it is exactly what gives it force. She offered an account of a man who was, with no cameras present and nothing to promote, genuinely working to be the person those cameras kept capturing, not flawlessly, not without questions and reckonings and honest conversations at kitchen tables, but consistently and without pretense. For this community, for the millions of Americans who have built gospel music and Christian faith into the texture of their daily lives, that account says something worth sitting with. The testimonies that travel farthest and last the longest aren't the polished ones that arrive clean and unbroken. The ones that endure are forged in quiet and unglamorous wrestling, exactly the kind of interior work Penrod's daughter described watching her father do during the years when nobody outside that Tennessee household could see it. Bill Gaither built the entire homecoming movement on that understanding. Real Christian faith, as Gaither has said across dozens of settings and interviews over the years, doesn't get airbrushed into something comfortable and easy. The artists who stand on those stages and lead thousands in worship drive home afterward and carry the same fears and accumulated weight as everyone sitting in the audience. And the songs mean more, not less, when the strain behind them is visible. Penrod understood that principle better than most of the people who shared those stages with him, and the reason his daughter's account feels like confirmation rather than surprise is that every fan who paid close attention already felt it in the music. If you have followed Guy Penrod since the early homecoming days, you know exactly what that confirmation feels like. The sincerity in that voice, the unguarded quality of his worship on those recordings pointed toward a man of real depth long before his daughter gave anyone the words to explain why it always felt that way. One more thread runs through this story that most people haven't connected to the main account, and it's worth following. Since Penrod stepped back from the Gaither Vocal Band, a quiet shift has moved through the broader world of gospel music and Christian ministry, a gradual willingness among artists in this space to speak honestly about what sustained, visible faith actually costs a person across the years, and what it asks of the family living alongside that person. That shift runs directly alongside everything his daughter described. Michael English carries one of the most discussed chapters in Gaither history, built on a voice of genuine power and a journey through the 1,990 seconds and 2,000 seconds that became painful, public, and ultimately honest. The candor English brought to his later interviews about the gap between the man performing on stage and the man struggling off of it required real courage to arrive at, and the gospel community is still reckoning with what he gave them by being willing to go there. English's specific story differs from Penrod's in significant ways, but the question living at the center of both accounts is identical. What does a life of visible Christian faith cost a person across the long run? And what does that cost look like from inside the family? Russ Taff answered a version of that same question in the documentary I Still Believe, and what emerged became one of the most talked about documents in recent gospel music history. Not because of the scale of the struggle Taff described, but because of the honesty he brought to describing it. Living alongside an artist carrying both an extraordinary public calling and a deeply private pain takes a toll this world rarely allows its people to discuss openly, and Taff was willing to say so plainly. The most important thing his faith ever required of him, he put it, was the willingness to be seen clearly, and he drew a specific distinction between clearly and perfectly that matters. Gaither himself, who has known most of these men longer than their careers have existed, offered a reflection in one interview that applies across the whole tradition of Southern gospel and contemporary Christian music. The most spiritually grounded people he encountered through decades of homecoming gatherings were consistently the ones most willing to name their own weakness. He was talking about the artists. He was talking about the audience, too. Penrod belongs in that lineage, and his daughter's account places him there without apology, not as a man spared from struggle, but as one who carried his struggle honestly, brought it back to Tennessee, and chose the harder and quieter work of showing up fully for the 8 people who needed him most. What comes next for Guy Penrod and his family is something the gospel community will follow with genuine affection. Penrod continues to perform, continues to record, and his voice, by every available account, has deepened over the years in a way that goes beyond the natural settling of an instrument into maturity. Something accumulated across 3 decades in there, the lived weight of the songs he has carried, and the difference between a voice performing conviction and a voice that actually earned it is something listeners feel without being able to name it precisely. His voice has always belonged to the second category, and everything his daughter shared explains why that quality was never in danger of leaving. One question his account leaves open isn't a troubling one, but the kind that keeps a legacy alive and worth watching. What Penrod is still becoming, and what the next chapter holds for a man who, according to everyone closest to him, hasn't finished surprising the people who love him, stays an open question for the gospel community to watch unfold. Fans who have stayed with this ministry through 30 years of homecoming stages and Sunday mornings and long drives with the radio turned up know one thing: this story isn't finished. Neither is the story of what that voice has meant to the millions of people who found in it something that ordinary language and ordinary music couldn't give them. If this account stayed with you, the next video will as well. We've been working through the untold chapters in the lives of the Gaither Vocal Band's most beloved voices, and what has surfaced in those conversations is every bit as unexpected, every bit as honest, and every bit as worth your time.